If you have any room on this page that says multiplying complex numbers, we're going to do an example similar to number 10. So the problem we're going to do is 2 plus 3i times 2 minus 3i. What I want you to notice is that these two complex numbers are identical except for the sign. One of them is addition, the other is subtraction, but otherwise they match. These are called complex conjugates. 2 minus 3i is the conjugate of 2 plus 3i. And I want you to see what happens when we multiply complex conjugates together. So if I distribute, 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times negative 3i is negative 6i. Then I distribute 3i. 3i times 2 is positive 6i, and 3i times negative 3i is negative 9i squared. Negative 6i and positive 6i cancel each other out. And negative 9i squared, remember that I squared equals negative 1. So this is negative 9 times negative 1, which is positive 9. So 4 plus 9 is 13. So the result of multiplying complex conjugates is a real number. We are going to use this concept to help us with fractions that have imaginary numbers in the denominator. We cannot leave a fraction with an imaginary number in the denominator because an imaginary number is a square root and we can't have square roots in the denominator. So turn the page and let's look at complex conjugates. Now these directions are a little bit wrong. This is from an old notes packet. So it should say example number 10. 10 and the extra example that we did are complex conjugates. Complex conjugates are when the two match completely except for one of them being addition and the other being subtraction. So 3 over 2 plus I. To get rid of the square root in the denominator, we need to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the complex conjugate. So if our denominator is 2 plus I, the conjugate would be 2 minus I. And whatever we multiply to the denominator, we have to also multiply to the numerator. On the top, we are simply going to distribute. So 3 times 2 is 6. And 3 times negative I is negative 3i. On the bottom, we have to double distribute. So 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times negative I is negative 2i. I times 2 is positive 2i, and I times negative I is negative I squared. Because we multiplied the complex number in the denominator by its conjugate, the two middle terms that have a plain I are going to cancel each other out. So negative 2i and positive 2i cancel each other out. Now, minus I squared. Remember, I squared equals negative 1. So this is minus a negative 1. What is minus a negative 1? Plus. So on the bottom here, we have 4, and we have plus 1, which would be 5. So our final answer is 6 minus 3i over 5. By multiplying by the complex conjugate of the denominator, the i's cancel out, the I squared becomes negative 1, and we no longer have any i's in the denominator, which means we don't have any square roots in the denominator, which is what we want. So what do you think we're going to have to multiply number 12 by? 3 plus I. So we need to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 3 plus I. Give that a try and see if you can simplify your answer. Negative 4I times 3 is negative 12I. Negative 4I times I is negative 4I squared. On the bottom, 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times I is positive 3I. Negative I times 3 is negative 3I. Negative I times I is negative I squared. Now, I know some of you like to write the least amount of work possible, so I'm going to show my work for simplifying on top of this. Negative 4I squared, that is negative 4 times negative 1. What is negative 4 times negative 1? Positive 4. So we have positive 4 minus 12I. Remember, you want to write that real part first and the minus 12I second. You always want your i's at the end. On the bottom, 3I and minus 3I cancel each other out. And minus I squared, that's minus a negative 1, which is a positive 1. So positive 1 plus 9 would be 10. If you have 4 minus 12I over 10, you have done the problem correctly. But now I want you to think about, do 4, 12, and 10 have anything in common?
2.
We could cancel out a factor of 2. So let's divide everything by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 12 divided by 2 is 6. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So the fully final correct answer is 2 minus 6I over 5. Now we didn't do that last step in number 11 because 6, 3, and 5 don't have anything in common, so we didn't have to do that. All right, take a look at number 13. What do we have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by?
1 plus 2I.
1 plus 2I. Now I got the question earlier, could you multiply by 5 minus 3I? And I mean, you could, but you wouldn't get rid of the i's in the bottom. You have to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. So we are going to multiply the top and the bottom by 1 plus 2I. Take a moment and do that and see if you can simplify it, and we will go through it together in about 2 minutes. Okay, the numerator, if we double distribute, we have 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2I is 10I. 3I times 1 is 3I. And 3I times 2I is 6I squared. Now on the denominator, 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 2I is positive 2I. Negative 2I times 1 is negative 2I. And negative 2I times 2I is negative 4I squared. Now let's start simplifying. The 10I plus the 3I will combine to 13I. You guys can't really read that up there. That's really weird the way it projects. 13I. Does that look better? Yes. 6I squared is 6 times negative 1, and 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. So we have 5 and negative 6, which would be negative 1, and 13I. So that's our numerator, negative 1 plus 13I. In the denominator, 2I minus 2I cancels each other out. Negative 4I squared is negative 4 times negative 1, which is positive 4. So in the denominator, we have 1 plus 4, which is 5. Okay, these 3 examples happened to all have a denominator of 5. That does not mean that all of these are always going to have a denominator of 5. It's just a really crazy coincidence that these all ended up with a denominator of 5. So it is possible to get a denominator of 9, 45, 12, 13, 276. Anything could be the denominator. It's not always 5. Just make sure whatever your denominator is originally, make sure you multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate of that denominator. So say your denominator was 2 minus 13i, you would multiply the numerator and the denominator by 2 plus 13i. Make sure you change it from minus to plus or from plus to minus.